So now it gives me a great honor to introduce to you our leader, a man who doesn't really need an introduction in these parts, but it's our fearless leader. He's a friend and a man that I've grown to really appreciate and love, and I can't say enough about him. Coming all the way from BC, the amount of work that he's done, the travels that he's done through the country, driving from BC all the way to as far as the East Coast, I believe. A man that seems to have an endless amount of energy and just an inspiration to us all. Mr. Rod Taylor.
Thank you. All right. Well, good evening. What a great opportunity to be together with so many good people in pursuit of a noble cause and with a will to sacrifice for that cause. Your commitment, your encouragement, and your persistent attention to detail in your EDAs, in your campaigns, in your provincial councils, and in your personal lives gives me strength and confidence that our labors are not in vain, and that trusting in God, not leaning on our own understanding, we will see His mighty hand at work in our lives. We'll know His voice directing our steps. I've titled this tonight, Victory Against Overwhelming Odds, so that gives you kind of the gist of where I'm going. There's an old saying, I may draw on a number of old sayings this evening. Mother never said it would be easy. She was right, by the way. As Winston Churchill remarked in his address to the U.S. Congress in the midst of the cruel and bloody World War II, we didn't get this far because we were made of sugar candy. The challenges faced by the founders of the Christian Heritage Party and those of us who have followed in their wake are not different in kind from the challenges faced by every earnest seeker after truth and justice from the beginning of time. Since Adam, every human being has faced the challenges and temptations of a sin-sick world in a social environment hostile to the promises and commands of God. If this task were easy, if establishing a righteous government were easy, if overturning the inadequate and convoluted legislation of past sinners were easy, everybody would be doing it. But it's not, and they're not. The kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force, the word says. And when the Apostle Paul says to us, I've fought the good fight, he wasn't overstating the case. When we think of the obstacles we face, either as individuals or in the Christian Heritage Party, let's remember what Paul went through while spreading the gospel, establishing churches, dealing with church discipline, and writing much of the New Testament. Along the way, he was persecuted by both Jews and Gentiles, shipwrecked 3 times, beaten with rods 3 times, stoned and left for dead, received 39 lashes 5 times, bitten by a poisonous viper, frequently hungry, thirsty, cold, and naked, imprisoned more than once, and ultimately executed for his faithful witness. Yet his words are still impacting lives today, and his triumph over every attack of the enemy is still encouraging believers today in the far corners of our world where persecution means torture and death. Paul did not shrink from his task or use his trials as an excuse for inaction. Instead, he said, I worked harder than all the rest. And I don't think that was a boast, but as an encouragement to us, he wanted us to know that he was giving it everything he had. So God can accomplish in us and through us abundantly more than we can imagine if we will truly trust Him. In this sinful world, this troubled world, this world of challenges and disappointments, there's no substitute for hard work. That was referenced today in this convention a couple times. Yes, prayer is essential if we're to get our marching orders clear. Wisdom is essential if we're to prepare ourselves for the task. Without God's guidance, our best efforts will come to naught. As the word says, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain that build it. But equally true, the house will not build itself, and the budget will not balance itself. The voting population out there, if uninformed, will not suddenly elect a Christian Heritage Party government just on a whim. They need to be convinced and persuaded. And how will they be informed if we don't tell them? CBC won't tell them. CTV and the Globe and Mail will not do our work for us. We have work to do. 38 years ago, the founders of this party correctly perceived that the inner circle of the big parties, the Liberals, Conservatives, the NDP, were not going to spend their political capital on the protection of innocent human life. They were not going to sacrifice their reputations defending traditional marriage or insisting on laws based on the supremacy of God. Our founders, and we thank them for it, took up the challenge, realizing that they had a responsibility to build a party that would defend life, family, faith, freedom, truth, and justice. And we are the beneficiaries of their wisdom and insight. And we have attempted here in this room over the past few days to clarify, to adjust, and to add to their very impressive original policy statements and their very well thought out constitutional objectives. Some of you, I know in this room, were there at the founding convention where those policies and the CHP Constitution were first ratified. But a great deal of the work that went into those founding documents took place in private homes, at cluttered desks, and in long evening sessions where 2 or 3 or 4 struggled to get the best wording for a policy statement. I thank our founders for that diligent and time-consuming effort. We do stand on the shoulders of giants. Those founders and we who follow in their footsteps have also faced other challenges. They, before us, and we in our day, have labored and sacrificed and struggled to establish credibility with voters as a legitimate political force. The establishment political class and the media manipulators controlling so much of public opinion, even back in 1986, were not eager to welcome another party to the Canadian discussion, especially one that challenged their assumptions about God, about human nature, about debt and dependency. But in spite of that sustained opposition, knowing in ourselves that our cause is just, that our purposes are noble, and our faith is able to sustain us, that hostility has made us resilient in spite of setbacks, obstacles, and disappointments. We have had to weather the storms, take the heat, renew our efforts, and rise again after repeated defeats at the polls. But every living thing on this planet has to deal with adversity in order just to survive. Mighty trees and prairie grasses alike are subject to fires, floods, and pests. Man and beast alike have been subject to death and decay ever since sin brought death into God's creation. The beautiful creatures that roam the Serengeti, elephants, zebras, giraffes, and wildebeests, all must travel great distances to find water, and when they find it, they face unseen dangers in its depths. As they travel, lions, leopards, and hyenas follow their tracks and prey on the most vulnerable. And even those who survive to a ripe old age eventually face death, as we all do. Yet in each one of these animals there is a will to live and a will to protect their little ones. When called on to fight, they fight. When their survival requires flight, they run as fast as their legs will carry them. And I remember seeing a tiny little mouse in a grain bin who apparently felt threatened by me. Why, I don't know. But he stood up on his little hind legs and his paws out there ready to do battle. He didn't give up because he was small and I was big. He knew instinctively that his best chance for survival was to bare his teeth at me and threaten violence. So almost every mammal and every bird will defend its young against much larger predators. They do it instinctively, and they are willing to risk their own lives to protect their little ones. Of course, many in our society today, shamefully and sadly, have been brainwashed and conditioned to abandon their own children in the face of adversity. And God asks a burning question in the Word: can a mother forget her infant child? And of course, in a normal world, the answer is no. But God foresaw this abnormal fallen world we live in, and He understands our failures and weaknesses. But He says, even if she forgets, I will never forget you. But that will to live, that drive to survive that we share with the animal kingdom has carried men and women through unbelievable circumstances. Many, many stories are out there of people who have been shot in the head and yet have survived, often in wartime conditions. I read recently about some prisoners who escaped from Soviet work camps and walked more than 4,000 miles through the worst winter conditions imaginable in their search for freedom and the chance to live. And they survived. The book Endurance, I recommend it, tells of Ernest Shackleton's failed Antarctic expedition, where the men had to leave their ship crushed in the ice, drag their sleds over countless miles of snow and ice in sub-zero weather, starving and frostbitten. They had to perform amputations of frostbitten limbs in the cruelest, filthiest conditions imaginable, and live for months on penguins that they managed to catch. Somehow they survived. Well, those are kind of extremes we hope we will never have to face. But the human condition is one that is never free from challenge and adversity. And while the level of trial certainly varies, every human being faces some obstacle, comes to some crossroads in his or her life, and is forced to make decisions that may lead to victory, fame, and glory, or to poverty, imprisonment, and death. Those decisions and the actions taken in response to difficulties are the stuff of history. And those rare men and women whose stories have become a part of our human record, both in the Bible and from other sources, are often ordinary people who have faced danger and opportunity at a particular moment in time and have chosen to trust God and to act in spite of circumstances, in spite of public opinion, in spite of the likelihood of failure, because they understood what was at stake. When victory seems impossible, as it often does, not every person will act. The Bible says that those who regard the clouds will not sow. Some will look at the situation and they'll jump to the conclusion that victory is impossible, and so they retreat or they compromise or they accept defeat. It's the rare human being who will look at the odds, the size and number of the giants, and who will say, "They're too many for me, but not for God." And that's the kind of people God calls us to be. When Winston Churchill accepted the role of Prime Minister in the dark days at the beginning of World War II, Europe was occupied and the British troops were surrounded at Dunkirk. A humiliating defeat seemed imminent. Only the grace of God, working through this powerful but imperfect man, protected the British Army till they could be rescued by that crazy fleet of fishing boats and other random vessels. Had Winston Churchill not had the passion, the confidence, and the audacity to refuse to negotiate with Hitler, World War II would have ended much differently. But he saw his place in history, a place prepared for him from the foundation of the world, and he recognized the dangers, but he saw his duty, and he did it manfully. It's easy sometimes to feel alone. Elijah complained in his day that he was the only one left serving God, but God said to him, "I've reserved to myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal." The Christian Heritage Party is small today if we compare it to the big parties. There's many in our country who have not yet taken out a membership in the CHP, but who also have never yet bowed to the image of Baal. These folks know what's at stake, They see the destruction of our beloved country. They understand the sovereignty of God. They understand the importance of faith and commitment. They lament the slaughter of the innocents, both the preborn and vulnerable seniors. They're passionate about the defense of our children and grandchildren from the woke ideology, and they're determined to do something about it. But they have not yet understood that without God, our nation cannot be saved. They have not yet understood that even in politics, God demands undivided and uncompromising loyalty. When they finally grasp that reality, the CHP will be for them an obvious choice. We've not yet seen that happen on a broad scale, but we know that with God, all things are possible, and we claim it by faith, which is the evidence of things not yet seen. Those brothers and sisters who have not yet joined us in the trenches have been led to believe that compromise and pragmatism are essential for political success. They've forgotten the promise from God that in quietness and in confidence shall be your strength. And we really shouldn't be surprised that even in the church, even among believers, even among born-again defenders of innocent human life, there will be divisions and diversities of strategies. We've known for a long time that those differences have kept some highly qualified CHP candidates from being elected. We've been urged, cajoled, and pressured to water down our policies, whitewash our identity, and join our efforts with one of the larger parties who share some of our views. We've been encouraged to take down our shingle or change our name or merge or support another party, one for which the defense of innocent human life is not a conviction, perhaps only a preference. But we can't go down that road of compromise. Moral compromise is what has gotten Canada into this mess in the first place. Our role in the CHP as ambassadors in Canada's political sphere has earned us a measure of respect from many of our pro-life allies, but so far, as is frequently pointed out to us, we've not yet elected a single member of Parliament. And because of this, we've been accused of splitting the vote, wasting resources, and preventing the election of candidates or a party that would be a little bit better than those in power today. The reality, though, is there's been very few specific candidate races over the years where the CHP has prevented the election of a Conservative MP, pro-life or otherwise. Where the Conservatives are strong, perhaps in the prairies, they have often won handily in spite of being challenged by CHP candidates. In areas where the Conservatives are weak, let's say in the urban centres, the stronghold of the Liberals, the NDP, the Greens, and the Bloc, the Conservative candidate would be unlikely to win regardless of whether or not there was a CHP candidate on the ballot. Yet even in those ridings, pro-life voters who do not understand the political process repeat their pathetic plea, "Don't split the vote." In doing so, they display their ignorance. First of all, your vote is a sacred trust given you by God, and it's your opportunity to declare to God and to man your principles and your ideals. When you vote, you encourage the man or woman in the race who is standing in defense of life, family, and freedom. Your vote tells your neighbor and your local reporter and the other candidates in the race and the leaders of their parties that there are still 7,000, hopefully many more than that, who have not bowed to the image of Baal. And your vote will give courage to a young man or woman, a young boy or girl, that there are things worth fighting and dying for. And then if enough people think like that and vote like that, one day there will be a CHP member elected to Parliament. And what would happen then? Well, when our first MP is elected to Parliament, there will be a great shaking and upheaval in the political landscape of our country. That event would do away, once and for all, with the defeatist attitude that for nearly 40 years has prevented the CHP from winning seats. When that lie is broken, that the CHP could never elect anyone, we will take our places that God has prepared for us at the gates of the city. But to get there, We need to press on through the wilderness because we're not made of sugar candy. We are the sons and daughters of the Most High God, and we are in Canada for such a time as this. So there's a short-term goal that is achievable. We can see it, we can taste it. We don't have it yet in our hands, but in God's time, with His help and by His wisdom, the CHP could win 1 or 2 seats. And when that will happen or where that will happen, we do not know. But in order for it to happen at all, we must be contending for many seats. We must offer voters in as many ridings as possible the opportunity to vote for life, family, and freedom. Because the reality is, unless we're seen as a serious contender, as a serious party, we will not convince the voters in any riding to give their sacred votes to our candidate. So we have several challenges, none of them new, in seeking to grow the CHP in size and maturity to the point where we could legitimately be considered as a party able to form government. Number one, people still don't know about us. They rarely hear us mentioned on CBC or CTV. They don't see our ads on national television. And as I mentioned earlier today, currently in 6 out of 7 electoral districts, there's no EDA and no candidate. That has to change. Number two, many of those who do know about us don't share our worldview. The vast majority of Canadians have accepted abortion as an unpleasant, perhaps, but unavoidable part of our life together. Many Canadians have a friend or family member who has had an abortion, and this includes, unfortunately, congregations of Christian believers. Many Canadians have a son, a daughter, a nephew, a niece, a brother, or a sister who has embraced a sexual lifestyle that we would say is in conflict with biblical standards. And there's a catastrophic level of divorce, broken homes, formerly married persons living with someone other than their spouse. Many Canadians have already said goodbye to a family member who ended his or her life with medically assisted suicide. They may not like that situation. They may realize it's destructive to our society, but they're not willing to endure or initiate a conflict within their families based on the principle of life. And number three, many of those who do know about us and who agree with us on life, family, freedom, speech, and the supremacy of God have been convinced that the CHP is too small to ever elect a single member of Parliament. They're unwilling to invest their time, their money, and their vote on a party that they deem to be a lost cause. How tragic that is. But those are the facts in Canada. The realities that we here must face boldly and overcome if our cause is to prevail. So, recognizing where we are at in Canada, the collapse of moral integrity, the abandonment of the biblical worldview, what can we do and what must we do to increase our impact and to ensure that the destroyers of civilization have no excuses to hide behind? Because if we fail to expose the unfruitful works of darkness, if we fail to speak up for the voiceless, the fatherless, then we fail in our service to God and country. We have a role to play, an important role, and a purpose to fulfill that does not depend on the attitudes or the awareness of our fellow citizens, especially those who do not know the Lord. 2 Chronicles 7:14, often quoted, is a promise from God to His people, and it's a conditional promise. It begins with a big word, if. If my people called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land. If we walk in obedience, trusting Him and doing His will, then He will heal our land. Well, are God's people walking in His ways? Are God's people trusting in Him and doing His will? Or are we trusting in human wisdom and doing our own thing? Well, the unspoken part of that conditional promise is, if not. If we don't do those things, we can't hold God to His promise. You're probably aware there's a great poem by Rudyard Kipling entitled If, and it begins with these lines, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if You can trust yourself when all men doubt you, yet make allowance for their doubting too. There's a number of good verses. I won't read the whole thing tonight, but it ends with this verse. You can look it up and find it. It's a great poem. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. There's a lot in that poem calling us to focus on what we can do, not about the circumstances blocking our way. Those familiar with the U.S. Civil War will remember the change that came over the Union Army when General Ulysses S. Grant was finally given command after the failures and retreats of general after general who lacked the wisdom or the will or the persistence to see the battle through. General McClellan, his predecessor, trained and equipped a mighty army, but then was afraid to use it. At the first hint of resistance, he pulled back and gave up important ground for which brave men had shed their blood. Well, when U.S. Grant, a dust-covered man on a dust-covered horse, took command, the men noticed a different attitude. They might lose a battle, but in the morning, instead of retreating, they were moving forward. He had heard his men talk about this Southern commander, Robert E. Lee, whom he would soon face on the field as a commanding general of the northern troops. His men were in awe of their opponent, of Robert E. Lee, and they had already basically accepted their defeat. But Grant told them, he said, I'm tired of hearing about what Robert E. Lee is going to do to us. Let's talk about what we're going to do to him. Bring up those guns. Let's get a move on here. This same U.S. Grant, when he was a young officer leading men into battle for the first time, was approaching the enemy's camp. And in his memoirs, he said his heart was in his throat. He had already proven his personal battlefield courage. He'd faced bullets before. But it was the first time he was carrying the responsibility of making decisions that could cost other men their lives, and it could lead to victory or defeat for the Union armies. As he and his men approached the brow of a hill, he was filled with apprehension. But when he crested the hill, he saw that the enemy had abandoned the camp and retreated. And he suddenly realized that the enemy was as much afraid of him as he was of them. And that revelation affected him for the rest of the war and strengthened his resolve. We also need to realize that our political adversaries and our competitors are also mere human beings with their own fears, their own insecurities. They may appear confident and aggressive, but they have their doubts. And if they don't have the fear of the Lord, they lack even the beginning of wisdom, which all you have, much more than the beginning of wisdom. As we look around the country, we may at times be intimidated when we see the numbers of members in the larger political parties. There are huge war chests filled with taxpayer dollars. When we see the momentum they have, their social media networks, the public exposure they get from the TV networks and so on. When we talk to our friends and neighbors and we hear over and over again, well, we can't risk splitting the vote, we have to get rid of Trudeau. If we allow ourselves to be gaslit by the defeatist rhetoric of those who have not yet shown the courage of their convictions, we could be tempted to give up the fight, to lay down our arms and surrender. But we didn't come this far because we're made out of sugar candy. The Bible is not a book of compromise and pragmatism. Our God calls us to resilience and confident obedience. He is more than able to equip you and you and you and me for the task at hand. And we have to take on our enemies one by one. And by enemies, I don't mean people. I mean the spiritual obstacles that have blocked our progress. We can't just whine and complain about the conditions that have impeded us. What are we going to do about them? When we say that most Canadians haven't heard about the Christian Heritage Party, we have to take steps to correct that lack of information. And we know it's difficult to do that with our small budgets, but we have to find and use cost-effective ways to accomplish the same objectives. Social media, of course, is one obvious part of that strategy, and our staff and volunteers are working hard to expand our reach on social media. Anna Maris, who's not here today, but she works part-time as our social media coordinator. She updates CHP Canada's Twitter and Facebook pages on a daily basis, and she promotes our weekly communiques, our CHP Talks interviews, and she brings in many other articles that she finds. She does a great job of keeping stuff out before the public, and I think has made a real difference. We've had a lot more interview requests from other organizations and podcasters than we've had in the past. Just in the last couple of months, we've had interviews with an organization, National Talk Radio, with a man named Sami Parvez, with the Truth Trumpet, which is hosted by our own Beth St. Dennis. We've had interviews with Major Russ Cooper, Insight Publishing, the BC Catholic, Liberty Dispatch, and Campaign Life Coalition's young interns, and I think some of them may be here tomorrow. Had a great, about an hour and a half chat with these 9 young people that are working the summer with Campaign Life. I value all these contacts, and I really appreciate all those sources helping us to spread the word about CHP. We've also done a couple of very successful advertising projects through the Rebel News. Ken Stouffer has led in those initiatives. They cost money, but they're essential in reaching new viewers and listeners who may never have heard about us before. In dealing with the second big challenge, the fact that a great many Canadians do not share our worldview, this highlights for us one of the main opportunities that the CHP, that God has given to the CHP to influence Canadian politics with our worldview. If we can get our commentaries, our reasoning, and our logic in front of the public, we give people the opportunity to change their mind about these important issues. Granted, that's a very difficult task. The people of Canada, especially voters in Canada, have been deeply influenced by media, by the leftist ideology inculcated in public school indoctrination programs, and more by peer pressure and the overwhelming dominance of leftist thinking. More and more, our governments have used oppressive measures to limit free speech and free thinking, and to cause many Canadians to, and this is really tragic, to self-regulate and self-restrict regarding the expression of their opinions. We saw this particularly during the truckers' convoy when the government used financial pressure, even seizing bank accounts to discourage citizens from protesting government policies. So that's truly, this censorship is truly the cutting edge of tyranny, and if allowed to continue, will spell the end of free speech in Canada and the loss of personal engagement on the issues that matter. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a Soviet dissident who exposed the terrors and violations of human dignity taking place in Russian communist work camps in his comprehensive 3-volume book, The Gulag Archipelago. And some 40 plus years ago, that book was part of my transition to becoming a Christian, part of my conversion. So I count them as important books. The depth of human depravity that was played out in last century by both Nazis and communists should be a sobering reminder to us that human society is never more than a few short steps from a democratic civilization to a hostile and mind-numbing dictatorship. Liberal bills like C11, C18, and C63, which are sold to us as legislation against online hate or to protect children from online porn, are really attempts to eliminate free speech and to punish any speaker or writer who is raising the alarm on the bureaucratic nightmare unfolding around us. But that's all the more reason for those of us who care about the future of our nation to continue to speak the truth boldly to all who will listen, probably to those who won't listen too. In doing so, we know that we risk, what do we risk? Defamation of character, financial losses through the courts, and ultimately the loss of our personal freedom. We've seen our friends arrested and put behind bars simply for speaking the truth on various issues. Linda Gibbons, a good friend of ours, is once again behind bars for having the temerity to silently, politely, and peacefully challenge the laws or lack of laws regarding abortion. We've seen our friend Bill Whatcott at the Supreme Court for distributing a truthful flyer about the dangers of homosexuality. And we've seen pastors like Arthur Pawlowski, James Coates, and Tim Stevens arrested for preaching during COVID and refusing to surrender to unscientific and unlawful mandates. But the darker it gets, the brighter our light should shine. The Bible tells us we should shine as lights in the world in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. Our national descent as a society into madness, hypocrisy, and tyranny is a great tragedy, but it allows us in the CHP and all Christians the opportunity to tell the truth when the world is telling lies. For many people out there hungry for the truth, our voice is a voice of reason and common sense. When the world around you is shrinking, doors of opportunity are closing, and the future seems fearful and threatening, a voice of reason that we offer is like cold water to a man dying of thirst. We didn't ask for this time of conflict and divisiveness, but it has come upon us, and it is our responsibility to speak boldly in the face of vile accusations and demonic perversity. There are many people who have woken up in the last few years, people who have given their hearts to Jesus because they've seen the corrupt culture and the corrupt institutions exposed. They want the truth and are willing in these days to consider even Christianity as an alternative to slavery. People who in the past had no direct connection to biblical morality are now outraged because of the gross immorality being imposed on young children in the public schools. People who had no interest in the laws of God have now been exposed to the brutal laws of man, and they recognize the difference. So in spite of the threats and the risk of financial harm, this is a great time to be a Christian, a great time to speak boldly about the things of the kingdom and the new life in Christ. As to the third challenge that we face, that is the fact that many Bible-believing, pro-life Christians have not yet joined the Christian Heritage Party of Canada. They've not yet given us the right hand of fellowship. They've not yet seen the wisdom of voting and working for the only party whose policies are 100% in alignment with theirs. But there's even hope on that front. The vast majority of Canadians vote out of fear, not out of conviction. Those fears are being stoked either by the mainstream media or by the parties represented in the House who claim, each one of them, that they are the only solution to Canada's problems. Some fear that if they don't personally vote Conservative, Justin Trudeau will be back in power and the world will end. Others fear a takeover by right-wing zealots, and they include Poilievre's Conservatives, Bernier's People's Party, and pro-life, pro-freedom CHP candidates in that basket of deplorables. For Christians, and especially pro-life Christians, the choice couldn't be simpler. CHP Canada offers them the policies they say they want with no compromise and no trade-offs. CHP will protect the lives of the innocent against abortion and medically assisted suicide. We'll stop the waste of taxpayers' money, end the vile indoctrination and manipulation of children in the public schools, end the bailout of big media, big banks, big tech, and big pharma, put our national defense back in fighting trim, honor and compensate our veterans, eliminate carbon taxes, slow inflation, protect our borders, and alleviate the crisis in affordable housing. What's not to like? But for many of our natural base, they fear voting for what they really want because it might split the vote. So they vote for a pro-abortion, pro-LGBT party leader like Pierre Poilievre in hopes that at least they can get rid of pro-abortion, pro-LGBT Trudeau. The challenge for us in the CHP is to convince those pro-life, pro-Christian voters that their vote matters. By voting for a CHP candidate, win or lose, They're declaring before God and country their commitment to pro-life, pro-family, pro-freedom principles. We have to convince them that their vote will influence future party leaders, future voters, and future candidates regarding the urgency and the viability of pro-life politics. We need to convince them that no matter what position the big parties take on the economy, on agriculture, on national defense, on taxes, on health care, on education, unless they're prepared to defend innocent human life, their other policies are doomed to fail. We need to convince them that as long as our nation is polluted with innocent blood, as long as our national leaders tolerate the shedding of innocent blood, we cannot expect God's blessing on our crops, our economy, our borders, our education system, our healthcare system, our banking system, or our justice system. God is not mocked. He hates hands that shed innocent blood, and he will not align himself with people who accept the shedding of innocent blood. Well, we Christians are a peculiar people. The Bible says so. Christians believe in divine creation. They believe in the parting of the Red Sea. They believe in King David or young David slaying the giant. They believe the walls of Jericho fell down so that the people of God could come in. They believe in the virgin birth of Jesus, the feeding of 5,000, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and the concept of eternal life for believers. But they don't believe that a Christian person expressing pro-life views and speaking biblical truth could ever be elected to the House of Commons. We need to challenge that unbelief. We need to do it kindly and without judgment, but we need to ask them if God is still on the throne, if he still does miracles today, if he requires obedience of his people, if he answers prayer, and if he's able to sustain his people even when they face disappointments and defeat. The world out there goes after movie stars, singers, and wealthy businessmen. The world loves winners, those who succeed in business, those who make a name for themselves, and those who are famous because they're famous, the good-looking, the prosperous, and sometimes in these wicked days, those who arrogantly flaunt their sexuality. Well, the CHP will never win this battle for the culture if we expect to generate the same kind of adoration and excitement based on wealth, glamour, or showmanship. Because the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they're mighty through God to the casting down of principalities and powers. And we, as Jim Enos points out often, are to bring into subjection every thought to the obedience of Christ. Without him we can do nothing, but with God all things are possible. And we need to have the same attitude that was displayed by the 3 Hebrew children when they were commanded to worship the image of Nebuchadnezzar. Other people have referred to that over the past couple of days. They spoke respectfully but firmly, and they said, our God is able to deliver us, and we trust him. But even if he does not, we will not worship or bow down to the image. Our God is able to give us everything we need and to put into office 1 or 2 or many CHP members to the House of Commons. He's able. He's able to provide the finances we need to run vigorous campaigns. He's able to bring our cause to the attention of voters in ways that we have not yet imagined. He's able to give us favor in the eyes of men and women, our fellow citizens, even those who do not share our worldview. He's able to defeat our enemies and to expose the works of darkness, to undermine the great forces arrayed against us. But even if he does not, we cannot and we must not yield to the temptation of compromising his principles to get votes. God's work, done his way and in his time, will not lack his provision. We in the CHP are used to living under difficult circumstances. It's good that we've been taught how to be flexible, how to be creative with limited resources, but a time is coming, I believe, when God will move mountains for us, when he will open doors for us, and when he will create opportunities for us that we have not yet seen or experienced since our birth as a party. As we stand together, trusting in the living God who gives us richly all things to enjoy and who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all we can ask or think, let's covenant together to fight the good fight of faith, not wavering from our purpose, and having not only confidence, but joy in the battle. Canada's walls are broken down, the foundations are under attack, but God commands us to arise and build, and God helping us, that's what we will do. Thank you.